Thank you very much, Daniel. So, I shall pass the handout.
Yeah.
So while the handouts are being passed around, allow me to introduce our second guest. And we have Sybrand Veeger, who is a PhD candidate at KU Leuven, working on Spinoza's metaphysics and political psychology. His research interests also lie in Spinoza's relationship with Descartes and Cervantes, and in contemporary French receptions of Spinoza. Sybrand will be speaking about the complex structure of pride, Superbia, one of the most powerful and devastating of the passions. And his presentation title is Spinoza on Pride, Ontology and Sociopolitical Diagnosis. So, Sybrand, please.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I'm going to read a paper that is sort of a draft that will eventually, I guess, become part of my dissertation, maybe first or second chapter. Yeah, so I'll read this paper. In the 7th chapter of the Political Treatise, Spinoza seeks to show what constitutes the best monarchic state. He wants to demonstrate the fundamental principles by which a monarchy can achieve a certain coherence or proportion of power between the king and the multitude, and thus effectively preserve in duration. The best monarchy is one where power would be distributed proportionately, and thus would endure with stability and security. Spinoza's argument is that in such a monarchy, the multitude would necessarily have to be free, rather than oppressed, or censored, or deceived. Towards the end of this 7th chapter of the Political Treatise, in paragraph 27, Spinoza makes the following assertion, in a rather bold tone, we could say. Dominantibus propria est superbia. Edwin Curley translates this as, pride is what sets rulers apart. But we could also translate it more literally, I think. What is proper to those who rule is superbia, pride. L'orgueil in Descartes' Treatise on the Passions, or Superbia in the Latin translation of the Treatise on the Passions by Descartes, which we know that Spinoza studied very carefully. Now, to better understand this assertion, we must identify who or what Spinoza is addressing, or we could say attacking with it. Spinoza here is answering objections that could be raised against the argument above that the multitude should be free rather than oppressed for a monarchy to endure with stability and security. Spinoza imagines that there are some authors, like Livy or Tacitus, according to Edwin Curley, a footnote by Edwin Curley, who would just laugh at this argument. And he uses the word risu, so they would laugh or smile at his argument, because of their conviction that the multitude, the common people, the plebeians, are infected by vices which rulers are naturally immune to. But Spinoza's suggestion is that what is really laughable here is the belief in some mystifying superstition that political rulers can in some way be above the common human nature and therefore deserving of some kind of worship. Hence Spinoza writes, natura una et communis omnium est, sed potentia et cultu decipimur. Everyone shares a common nature. We're just deceived by power and cult. In the next sentence, he makes the bold assertion, what is proper to those who rule is superbia. And immediately he goes on to give an enumeration of the various vices of such proud rulers, and also to identify the strategy through which they use or abuse their power to deceive people into believing the superstition that they are above the common human nature. The vices of superbia include arrogance, arrogancia, a sort of disdainful fastidiousness, fastu, extravagance, luxu, wastefulness, prodigalitas, a sophisticated folly, docta incipiencia, and a refined shamelessness, turpitudinis elegantia. And the strategy through which proud rulers deceive people into believing in the fiction of their superhuman nature is what Spinoza calls this is Curly's translation, a certain blending of these vices, certoque viciorum consentu, which, taken together, form like a composition, a concert of proud affects. Consentu. Yeah, a concert of proud affects. Now, the suggestion is that these very political leaders, themselves sickened by superbia and its certain composition or concert of vices, project their own madness onto the multitude. How? Because in their God complex, in the delirium that they are above human nature, they believe the multitude, the plebeians, do not have the capacity to judge or to understand their superhuman or divine-like decisions. Hence, they govern in secrecy, hiding themselves or lying about what they do, or saying one thing and doing another, etc. But, as Spinoza maintains, I quote, it's the greatest stupidity, summa insitia est, to want to do everything in secrecy and then expect the citizens not to judge the government's actions wrongly and not to interpret everything perversely. We identify here a recognizable Spinozian line of reasoning, explained, as we know, in great depth in the Ethics. For example, in the appendix to part 1 of the Ethics. Namely, Spinoza's identification of the necessary tendency of an affective disposition to project itself onto the external world. In this case, pride, superbia, is projected onto the multitude. We can sum up this mechanism of projection as follows. Superbia, characterized by its superstitious delusion of being above common human nature, leads rulers to govern in secrecy and through deception, because they regard the people as being below them and incapable of judging what they do or understanding their decisions, naturally causing the multitude to interpret the actions and decisions of those same rulers wrongly or perversely, because they're doing everything deceptively or in secret, etc. In turn, making the multitude appear as ignorant and stupid, as vulgar plebeians. Thus, the proud project their affect onto the multitude and judge the multitude according to that affect. And not only does the multitude appear as vulgar plebeians to the rulers, but, and here I connect this line of reasoning to the important argumentation in chapter 20, the last chapter of the Political Treatise, and perhaps we could link it to the argument at the core of that treatise as a whole, namely, that if such a multitude, or as Spinoza sometimes clarifies, if the strongest part of the multitude, in such hostile, secretive, deceptive, and corrupt conditions attempts to voice a disagreement, or makes an effort to resist against any of those actions or decisions by its proud rulers, they will be censored, repressed, or oppressed with violence. And this is, as we all know, the very thing that threatens the stable endurance and security of the state, in any form, monarchic or otherwise. So pride, superbia, as a strategy and affective disposition of political rule, is ultimately self-defeating. Spinoza then goes on to conclude section 20, or paragraph 27 of that 7th chapter of the Political Treatise with the following lines, which I would like to take as a cue to then move on to the ethics. Spinoza writes in an insistent tone, quote, "As we have said, everyone has the same nature." And then he adds what seems to be a word of warning or precaution. Everyone is proud when he's master. Everyone terrorizes when he's not cowed by fear. So it seems that precisely because we all share a common human nature, that we are all equally susceptible to superbia, especially when we imagine our power to be unrestricted, limitless, that nothing can stop it. Now, this is exactly the mechanism Spinoza explicates with great precision, and we could say with metaphysical depth and complexity in his discussions of superbia in parts 3 and 4 of the Ethics. But first, I should say something about Spinoza's view on affective madness in general, on delirium. In the Ethics, Spinoza categorizes a certain group of affects as species of delirium, species delirii. These are affects which are not only impotent, but also, strictly speaking, ill or insane. Generally speaking, such mad affects for Spinoza are species of love, or of excessive love, or to be slightly more precise, species of excessive pleasure linked to a certain external cause. Although, of course, we could also see sad affects like hatred or melancholy as ill, but surprisingly enough, Spinoza does not explicitly classify these as species of delirium. Hobbes, by the way, in the Leviathan, in the first part, he does say that melancholy is a form of madness. But Spinoza doesn't use the word delirium, to talk about melancholy or any of the sad affects, at least that I could find. These are the examples he gives. Gluttony, excessive love of food. Lust, excessive love of sex. Greed, excessive love of money, of wealth. And ambition, excessive love of esteem. Now, if we attempt to follow the concatenations of proofs of propositions 43 and 44 of Ethics 4, an affective delirium functions, according to Spinoza, in the following manner. A part of the body becomes, as it were, overstimulated by a certain external cause, to the point that this pleasure, a local joy, provokes a disequilibrium in the body, and something like an obsession or an addiction. As Spinoza writes in the demonstration to proposition 43 of Ethics 4, referring to the crucial proposition 6 of also part 4, a mad affect is characterized by being, quote, stubbornly fixed in the body, affectus pertinaciter adheriat, and so prevents the body from being capable of being affected in a great many ways. Hence, it is evil in the Spinozian sense of reducing our capacity to affect and to be affected. When taken over by such obsessive or addictive and thereby mad affects, we begun to dream with open eyes. This this formula that Spinoza uses to characterize madness. Now, François Sourabichvili, in Une physique de la pensée, in a section called Les statuts de la maladie dans l'éthique, remarks that in such cases, and this is my translation, the complexity of the body itself is threatened by the hegemonic titillatio of one of its parts. In such cases, Sourabichvili maintains, the body begins to, quote, obey, at least temporarily, another proportion of rest and movement between its parts. So gluttony, lust, ambition, greed are all examples of affective madness. They are excessive pleasures caused by particular external objects: food, sex, esteem, money. Pleasures which become so powerful and hegemonic, to use Sourabichvili's adequate Gramscian expression, that the complexity and the equilibrium of the body become jeopardized and deformed. The complexity and the equilibrium of the body become jeopardized and deformed, and therefore we run the risk of losing our mind. That is, of losing our nature and being taken over by a different, alien one. So after this detour, we should return to our main problem. What about the case of pride, superbia? Spinoza also categorizes this affect as a species of delirium. Specifically in the Scholium to proposition 26 of Ethics 3. Scholium to proposition 26 of Ethics 3. However, the mechanism there seems to be less straightforward than in the affects mentioned above. Pride is defined in this Scholium as a, quote, joy born of the fact that a man thinks more highly of himself than is just. Joy born of the fact that a man thinks more highly of himself than is just. As such, it is a species of madness, species delirii est. Quote, because the man dreams with open eyes that he can do all those things which he achieves only in his imagination, and which he therefore regards as real and triumphant, so long as he cannot imagine those things which exclude the existence of these achievements and determine his power of acting. End quote. Pride, in other words, is a delirious species of love, like the other species of madness we saw above. Gluttony, ambition, greed, lust. So pride is a delirious species of love, like the other species of madness. But what is different about pride is that it's a species of self-love. And Spinoza uses here the term amor sui, self-love, amor propre, in the definition of Superbia, at the end of part 3 of the Ethics, definition 28. In the explication to that definition, Spinoza identifies amor sui with another affect he calls acquiescentia in se ipso. He uses the formula amor sui sive acquiescentia in se ipso. I owe this insight to note 172 by Pierre-François Moreau and Jacqueline Lagré of their 2020 French translation of the Ethics. The notes in this are really, really amazing. So if we wish to formulate an adequate reconstruction of Superbia, we must first take a look at the definition of acquiescencia in se ipso, self-esteem or self-love, satisfaction de soi-même. Namely, definition 25 at the end of Ethics 3, where Spinoza writes that this affect, acquiescencia in se ipso, which is synonymous with self-love, quote, is a joy born of the fact that a man considers himself and his own power of acting. A joy born of the fact that a man considers himself and his own power of acting. In other words, this is a joy with the idea of oneself as its cause. That is, the image of one's power, or conatus, as the cause of one's joy. But how do we form such an idea? Well, as long as we remain in the first kind of knowledge, this idea of myself must be an imagination, an inadequate and universal idea of myself, based on the aggregation of images I form of the effects of my actions in the world. So a universal idea of myself based on the aggregation of images I form, the confused aggregation of images I form of the effects of my actions in the world. The question then becomes, how does self-love, acquiescencia in se ipso, defined in this way, become excessive and delirious? How do we explain the surplus of acquiescencia? To answer this, we just need to return to Spinoza's first mention of that affect of the affect of Superbia in the Scholium to proposition 26 of Ethics 3, where Spinoza says that Superbia is a species of madness, and I read it again, because the man dreams with open eyes that he can do all those things which he achieves only in his imagination, and which he therefore regards as real and triumphant. And now comes the explanation of the excess of self-love. Quote, so long as he cannot imagine those things which exclude the existence of these achievements and determine his power of acting. Pierre-François Moreau, interestingly, but maybe a bit controversially, translates determinant agendi potentiam as limite sa puissance d'agir, instead of, like Edwin Curley, determine his power of acting, which I think makes more sense in the context, Moreau's translation. So I'll read it again, now starting with Curley and ending with Moreau. In Superbia, quote, the man dreams with open eyes that he can do all those things which he achieves only in his imagination, and which he therefore regards as real and triumphant, aussi longtemps qu'il ne peut imaginer ce qui exclut leur existence et limite sa puissance d'agir. So, what Spinoza seems to be saying here is that self-love becomes delirious when we lack the contrary imagination that would give us an indication of our lack of power. That is, an imagination of our frustrated power. By the way, I should say that this became clear to me after a conversation with Professor Laurent Bove last week. It seems that Spinoza, the philosopher of pure joy, is saying here that we, every now and then, need our power to be frustrated, that is, saddened, in order to regulate our acquiescencia in se ipso, that is, in order to moderate our self-love. Sadness, therefore, becomes necessary eventually to form an adequate idea of myself, of my singular essence, when we form, I guess, the vera acquiescencia in se ipso. So what happens when self-love is not counteracted by any imagination of our impotence, of our lack of power? Well, we imagine, and here I paraphrase Roland's example from the other day, we imagine, perhaps like a child would, that we can do anything at all, that we have superhuman powers, that we can chop down trees with our hands because our arms are swords. But eventually, the child gets hurt. His power becomes frustrated by pain, or by shame, or by a parental warning, and thus realizes, the child, that his hands are not swords, and that he cannot chop down trees with his hands. He realizes, in short, that his power is human. So now let us return to Spinoza's example at the end of paragraph 27 of the 7th chapter of the Political Treatise, namely the word of precaution I read earlier, maybe the parental warning. It reads, as we've said, everyone has the same nature. Everyone is proud when he's master. Everyone terrorizes when he's not cowed by fear. In other words, everybody who assumes a position of domination is susceptible to superbia if their power goes unrestricted. That is, if there is no mechanism in place to keep him in check with the threat of pain, of fear. The ruler should feel a moderate and healthy fear of the masses, to use Etienne Balibar's well-known phrase. Otherwise, in the absence of any limitation of the ruler's power, the Commonwealth runs the risk that he loses his mind and, like an adult child, gives in to the delirium that he is above human nature, or, to borrow a phrase from Laurent Bove, gives in to the desire to be a god, désir d'être Dieu, above common human nature, desire to be a god. And we can understand why such an adult child, in this hallucination of being above the common human nature, is easily prone to hatred, to fits of rage, and to violence, to causing and propagating war rather than fighting for peace, because he imagines himself to be justified in destroying whatever he feels is below his nature, like an insect or like a plague, and also feels justified in being cruel, that is, in perversely enjoying the destruction of whatever or whomever he feels is by nature waste, that is, essentially by nature discardable. So that is a sketch of an internal or internalist explanation of superbia, that is, a reconstruction starting from the natural tendencies of the conatus to expand itself limitlessly. But I think we could also provide an externalist account by appealing to a key external mechanism linked to pride, what Spinoza calls adulatio, flattery. La flatterie in Descartes' treatise on the passions, where it is also connected to l'orgueil, to superbia. In proposition 57 of part 4 of the Ethics, Spinoza writes, Superbus parasitorum seu adulatorum presentiam amat. In Curly's translation, the proud man loves the presence of parasites or flatterers. So superbia loves flattery. The reason for this is straightforward. Adulators, parasites or flatterers, instead of setting limitations on the imagination that the ruler has of his own power, they do precisely the opposite. They blow up their self-love by means of what Spinoza calls overestimation, exestimatio, an affect Spinoza first defines in the same place where he introduced the affect of superbia, which we already read, the Scholium to proposition 26 of part 3. There he writes, superbia, pride, I'm quoting, pride is joy born of the fact that a man thinks more highly of himself than is just, and the joy born of the fact that a man thinks more highly of another than is just is overestimation, exestimatio. So, parasites and flatterers, adulators, through overestimation, will themselves experience joy from blowing up the self-love of the ruler to the point of madness, superbia. And thus, as Spinoza writes in the Scholium to proposition 57 of Ethics 4, the same proposition in the Scholium, Parasites and flatterers make a madman of a fool, ex stulto insanum faciunt. Taking the phrase from the Roman playwright Terence, apparently, according to Moreau et Lagré. So yeah, ex stulto insanum faciunt, make a madman of a fool. Now the question that can be raised here is, who are these parasites and flatterers who take advantage of the impotence of a fool and, through overestimation, transform him into a mad, raving, violent ruler? What affects are they driven by? Well, what else than by ambition and greed, and perhaps lust and gluttony as well? The species of delirium behaving the mechanism we saw earlier. Isn't an excessive love of esteem and an excessive love of money, in other words, addictive and distorted desires for power, for domination, but also for wasteful pleasures, rather than a genuine love for the common good, what provokes these figures to reinforce the superstitious, more than human and mystifying image of the ruler, instead of setting healthy limitations on his power? So the point I would like to highlight and conclude with is this. There seems to be an essential link established deeply in the concatenations of proofs in part 3 and 4 of the Ethics between the two categories of delirium explained above. An essential link between, on the one hand, those species of madness produced by the excessive love of an external cause, ambition, greed, and why not gluttony and lust as well, and, on the other hand, the species of delirium produced by an excessive love of oneself, Superbia. In other words, there is something like a reciprocal relationship or affective complex, a composition or a concert of mad and ill affects, which realizes itself through the distortions and the deformations natural to the workings of political or institutional power. But, as I've been trying to suggest, these distortions and deformations are not exclusive to the political domain. They function according to the same and univocal affective structure of the conatus itself, that is, according to the same causal structure that we all have in common. Since, as Spinoza reminds us in paragraph 27 of the 7th chapter of the Political Treatise, everyone shares a common nature. We're just deceived by power and cult.